I grew up in southern Appalachia, in western North Carolina 30 minutes outside of the town of Asheville. The hills and hollers of the Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest mountains in the world, with some of the rock formations dating back over 1 billion years. That quite literally means they were here before there were terrestrial animals. As with most things that have been on the earth a long time, there are inexplicable anomalies both benevolent and malevolent. For example, the Brown Mountain Lights. Never in my life have I felt threatened or uneasy when witnessing them from Wiseman's view. They're neither good nor evil, they just are. On the benevolent side, sometimes when you walk through an abandoned old church, up near mom and dad's property line, you can feel good, warm and happy energy. It's like that first warm day of summer when the sunshine is not too hot but it's not cold. Well, this story is not about one such anomaly. It's about something that was definitely malevolent. About a decade ago I was in night school up at AB Tech, going to school for automotive mechanics. I would go into class at about 2 p.m. after I got off my part-time job, and I would end up getting home about 10:30 p.m. depending on traffic. Every night I drove the same road, in my old 1973 W200 Dodge pickup. Some nights it would get rather boring and I would take a different route, jump off of I-40 and drive the back roads. On this particular evening I had decided to just stay on I-40 because I just wanted to go home and go to bed. It was Thursday and there was no class on Friday, and I wanted to get in bed early so I could go out into the woods and go hiking early tomorrow morning and watch the sun come up. As I jumped off of I-40 onto the exit where my parents lived, the night seemed to get darker and none of the animals that I could hear through my rolled down windows made any more noise. The cab of my truck became smaller and smaller and my breathing quickened. I have never faced any kind of anxiety in my life, but at that moment something felt off and there was no way I could put my finger on what it was. I came to a stop on the exit ramp. Turned to go down the road and I happened to notice that the gas station off the exit where mom and dad lived had no lights on. They were a 24-hour truck stop and always had lights on, but I didn't think about it again after noticing. I just chalked it up to the power being out, but I could not shake the feeling that something was definitely askew. I slowly shifted through all of my old truck's gears, not wanting to make any more noise than an old pickup already did. I leaned over my steering wheel to look up at the moon through the windshield, and there were barely any stars visible, which was way out of the ordinary. If you've ever been to Appalachia, primarily the sparsely populated areas where I'm from, you can see the Milky Way on clear nights. An absence of stars back home is only due to cloud cover or whatever in the hell went on this particular night. As I rounded a particularly sharp left-hand curve and chugged through a straight stretch before the next right-hander, I looked at the ancient, decaying barn I always gazed at when riding that stretch of road and thought about how long that thing had been here and how many advancements in civilization it had seen. For the split second that my gaze wandered, a very large, sickly-looking dog ran out in front of my truck, no more than 10 feet in front of me. Old Betsy was a good truck, but she didn't stop well. Thump thump. I heard the fence posts I had left in my truck bounce up out of my bed and then back into it as I slid to a stop. My first thought was, oh God, now I have to go tell these neighbors that I ran over their dog. That shit doesn't go real far with people around here. It can really kind of set them off depending on the dog and the person. As I sat there breathing in the smell of burning rubber, something else found its way into my nose. The stench of rotting flesh. It's not a smell you ever forget once you smell it one time. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time, I just chalked it up to some rotting roadkill nearby. Finally, I thought to myself, let me go check and see who this dog belongs to. I pushed my clutch in, shifted to reverse, and as I looked in my rearview mirror, illuminated by the haunting glow of my reverse lamps, was the same dog, only it wasn't on 4 legs anymore. It had stood up, like a man. A man well over 10 foot tall. Only then did it dawn on me that the front of my truck was every bit of 5 foot tall, and this dog was every bit of 5 foot tall at the shoulder on all fours. As it turned its head to look in the direction of my truck, I caught only a glimpse of this creature. It was not a dog, it was not a man, it was somewhere in between and at the same time entirely separate altogether. Its skin hung loose off of its emaciated and thin frame, like a raccoon. Bits of matted fur and dirt and mud clung to its legs like a disease. The right arm seemed a little longer than the left, and they both hung abnormally low, in relation to either animal this creature seemed to be. As it regained its senses, it turned and looked into the mirror like it knew exactly where I was sitting. The face was that of a man's, but the very edges of its face seemed to not be totally defined. They seemed to move and change like something you would see at a cellular level in a scientific documentary. There were no eyes but only sockets where eyes should have been, no hair, and the skin that was dripping off its face was a cold, lifeless gray color. The nose was short and shoved into its face, like a bulldog, but the teeth still haunt me. It was definitely carnivorous, and true to form of the rest of its unnatural look, many of the teeth didn't seem to be arranged in a natural way in its mouth. They seemed to fill and spill forth from the indefinable face. Almost like they knew the horror they occupied and they were searching for a way out. It stared through my life, into my eyes and past my soul. It seemed like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds that I sat there, paralyzed. A light came on at the house next to the road, causing the creature to snap its gaze in that direction and tear off into the woods on its back 2 legs, like a man. I jammed my old truck in first gear and roasted tires all the way through first, snatched second gear and drove as fast as I could home. When I got to the house, both of my parents were asleep. I went downstairs into my bedroom and loaded every firearm I possessed and locked all of the doors. I couldn't wake them up. Who the fuck would believe that, and at 10:30 on a Thursday night? The basement was eerily quiet that night. Even their dogs that got up to raise hell at outside animals at all hours of the night were dead silent. The old post in Beam House didn't even creak or pop that night, as was usual. At about 3 a.m., I started to finally get drowsy, and as I went to lay my head down to get some sleep so I could still attempt to go hiking the next morning, I smelled the stench of death again. It was faint at first, but it was definitely there. I thought to myself, you're just going crazy, none of that shit was real. But as I dwelt on it, it became more and more noticeable until it filled the entire basement. My dad has a home office in the basement with 2 large glass doors that face Pisgah National Forest, an impenetrable 500,000-acre woods. I finally worked up the courage to walk out of my bedroom and into the basement living room, with my little tactical 12-gauge, loaded, tack light on. I covered the flashlight with my hand so as not to make my presence known until need be, and as I turned right out of the living room into my father's office, I shined the light through the glass doors, and at the edge of the woods, there stood the creature. It was motionless. It stared right into the light, unafraid, with those soulless sockets, devoid of eyes. I quickly covered my tactical light, ran into the living room, flipped on the outdoor floodlights, and to my surprise it was no longer standing at the edge of the woods, but between the house and the edge of the woods, still motionless. I swung the door open and fired every round I had in its direction. I must have scored a couple of hits because it screeched an unearthly scream, like that of a woman being slaughtered, as it took off into the woods. The dogs went crazy. Mom and Dad woke up asking me what the hell I was doing. I told them that a bear had gotten into the trash and I was scaring it away. They didn't believe me, but I knew they wouldn't believe the truth either. I didn't sleep that night, or any time until the following Sunday. Everything seemed to return to normal, and I didn't think about the creature again until I met my wife about 6 years later. Her mother's house sits at the mouth of the holler, no more than 4 or 5 miles up the road from my mother and father's. Up on the side of the holler there are kennels for her brother's hunting dogs. No longer in use, and haven't been in years, but the fence is still there and the concrete pad is still there. It's a thing of great use when you need to quarantine an animal. Her Great Pyrenees had gotten into a tussle with a raccoon, which of course he destroyed, but his rabies vaccination had lapsed, so we had to keep him quarantined for a time. It didn't bother him, he kind of likes solitude. This particular night that we were coming home from a movie date in a neighboring town was the last night of quarantine for him. So we walked up the trail using our phone flashlights to get to the kennel, and there he sat, patiently waiting, tail wagging, happy to see us. We put him on a leash and started walking back to the house with him. As we were walking back through the darkness, I started to feel the same feeling I had felt the night I hit the creature in my truck. I didn't say anything so as not to alarm my wife, but then the smell came wafting in on the breeze. She jokingly asked me, "My God, what did you eat? You stink." I half-assed laughed, not being able to fully appreciate the joke for the horrors that raged within my mind. She immediately caught on and asked me what was wrong, to which I could only reply, "I'll tell you later." She grew up in the woods and around hunting and things of that nature her whole life, so she knew what I meant. She knew we were being watched by something. When we could see the lights of the house from the trail to the kennel, we heard it. There came barking from the kennel that sounded just like the Great Pyrenees we had on a leash next to us. It was a perfect imitation. The Pyrenees, being a guardian dog, immediately sensed that something was wrong, and so he turned to face the danger, belting out deep barks and growls in that direction. I don't know if you've ever had to drag a 150-pound dog, but it sucks and is no easy task. I'm 6 foot tall and 240 pounds, and it was all I could do to get him back to the house. The barking never ceased the entire time we were running towards the house. In fact, it seemed to grow closer and closer until it seemed it was coming from inside my own head. Her mother heard the commotion and flipped the floodlights on as we made it into the fence of the yard, and I caught a glimpse of something coming to a dead stop at the end of where the light reached, wheeling around and tearing off back into the darkness. My wife looks at me and goes, "You want to tell me what the fuck that was?" To which I replied, "Yes, let's go inside." I told her the story and she listened intently, hanging on every word. Her family came from a long line of granny witches and other supernatural healers of the Appalachians, so her older sister came over the next morning with some herbs and chants to bless the property and to ward off evil. I suggested we go up to the dog kennels and do them as well. When we got to the kennels, they were completely destroyed. The very concrete foundation was cracked and the chain-link fence was torn off of its posts. The dog houses were destroyed and the place reeked of the stench that followed the creature. My wife's older sister just went about her business like normal, blessed the place, burned some herbs and let us back into the property. When we got in the house, she wheeled about on us suddenly and instructed us very firmly to never go into the woods after dark. Not until this thing left me alone. To make a long story short, my wife joined the military and she ended up getting stationed in Delaware. Well, as someone who's lived around fairly large mountains and endless wilderness their entire life, Delaware is pretty terrible. At least that was my thought when we first moved into the middle of a 50,000-plus population city. Fortunately though, it didn't take us long to find a house in a sleepy little community, further south. We purchased the house and moved in with haste. We were both very grateful and glad to be out of the city and into a rural setting again. The land in Delaware seems lifeless in comparison to Appalachia. The sparsely populated woods don't possess any energy that goes one way or the other. The ground doesn't seem to be alive like it is in Appalachia. Having not thought about the creature in a long time, I resumed my staying outside after dark and playing with our dogs in our rather large yard that borders a small patch of woods. Well, last night I went outside to play with the dogs, and as dark sat and I built a decent-sized fire in my fire pit and consumed some good old-fashioned Appalachian mountain cough syrup from a mason jar, and just as the fire was dying down, my American bulldog tore off towards the woods. He has a habit of running off to go on adventures, so my immediate instinct was to chase him down in the yard and tackle him so he could not get away. As I tackled his 110-pound ass to the ground and threw him in a fireman's carry over my shoulders, I heard him begin to bark. Only, the bark was not coming from him. The only sound coming from him was a deep, rumbling growl. A noise I've never heard him make. It was a threatening noise, something was definitely wrong, and as I ran with him on my shoulders back to the house, the stench of death again began to fill the air. The two other dogs must have caught wind of what was happening and met me at the back door, which I threw open, slammed shut, locked, and again loaded my firearms. How the hell could this thing have followed us 650 miles up here? As I flipped my floodlights on, at the backside of my house, several of the bushes and small trees at the forest's edge were still shaking like something had just run through them. My dogs went crazy all night, barking and howling and attempting to get out the windows. I didn't sleep a bit, and I don't think I will for a while. I know for sure I won't be in the woods after dark ever again in my life, not until this thing is gone. This is going to sound completely insane. I've been sitting on my phone for the past few hours trying to decide if I should even share this. The idea of it is so absurd, I can barely wrap my head around it. But, if anything, I need to have some record of this experience if things take a turn for the worst. And they're starting to look pretty bad. It all started about a month ago. For some context, I live with my roommate in a small flat in Washington, D.C. I'm not home a whole lot because my job requires me to work upwards of 70 hours a week. I came home one night after a harrowing day of work. It was pretty late and, I thought, my roommate was already asleep. I was fully prepared to do my nightly routine and hop right into bed. I unlocked the door to my apartment, set my keys on the kitchen counter and opened the fridge to scarf down some leftovers from the day prior. I turned my back from the kitchen counter for not even a minute as I rummaged through the fridge, scouring each shelf for my Tupperware container of taco meat. Upon finally finding it, I turned back around to head towards the microwave and heat it up. But something caught my eye. There were now 2 sets of keys on the kitchen counter. No, that's not right, I thought to myself. I knew I had just put my keys on the empty kitchen counter. So how could another set have magically appeared? Was I so tired I was seeing double? I rubbed my eyes, but the replica keys remained, still next to mine, clear as day. I tried to rationalize it immediately. I'm a logical guy. I can always find an explanation for even the most absurd phenomena. I knew I didn't have any spare keys, despite my mother's constant insistence that I made copies just in case. So how could another keychain, identical to the one I own nonetheless, materialize next to mine in an instant? I figured my roommate had crept in behind me and placed his keys on the table next to mine. I was probably so exhausted I hadn't even heard him come in. Though this explanation made the most amount of sense, upon further inspection, I realized the keys were an exact replica of mine. Right down to the Charmander keychain I had since I was a teenager. There were keys on this mysterious replica that I knew for a fact my roommate couldn't have had. For instance, I saw keys to offices in the building I worked at. The keys were even positioned the same way I had set them down. It looked as if someone had copied the exact placement of my keys and pasted it directly beside them on the counter. It was utterly impossible. But again, I insist that I was not an irrational man. Not then, at least. I knew this had to be some kind of prank. My roommate and I weren't close. He was a pretty peculiar guy with interests that differed from mine. We didn't interact much besides the occasional cordial greeting. But I never would have expected him to be smart enough to play a prank like this. It was odd. Even for him. I continued to reason away, coming up with any plausible explanation for the duplication of my keys as I ate my dinner in silence and headed to bed. But I couldn't sleep that night. I tossed and turned in sweat through my sheets. I had known in my gut something wasn't right. But I had ignored it, for the sake of my own sanity. The next morning, the cloned keys were gone. Only 1 pair remained on the kitchen counter. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to me being so sleep-deprived that I was imagining things. Boy, was I wrong. After about 2 weeks, I had honestly almost completely forgotten about the whole incident. That was, until it happened again. This time, I had just gotten out of the shower on my 1 day off. It was Saturday and I had decided to go for a quick run around the city for some exercise. I had arrived back at my apartment and taken my AirPods out to jump in the shower. I placed them on my dresser without a second thought before gravitating towards the bathroom to do my thing. About 15 minutes later, I leisurely made my way out of the bathroom, heading towards my dresser to throw on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt when I saw it. 2 AirPod cases lay before me. One right where I had left it, and a duplicate right beside it. I had to bite back a scream. Where had the other case come from? How could I even discern the difference between the two? Which one belonged to me? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the scene before me in disbelief. I even contemplated whether or not I was going cross-eyed. I imagined the horror of beginning to see double of singular objects. I eventually, tentatively, reached a hand out to touch one of the cases to prove this theory. But I felt it in my hand. I felt them both in my hands. At the same time. That was when I decided something was seriously wrong. Now, what I did next I can't provide an explanation for. I'm not sure what came over me. Perhaps it was sheer curiosity. Whatever it was a mistake. I had scrambled over to my bed, tearing away at the sheets and the comforter, to find my phone and ran back to the AirPod cases. I picked one of the cases up. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was picking up the duplicate or the original, but, in hindsight, I'm assuming it was the duplicate. I stared at my phone and saw they were connected to the AirPods. I pressed play on a song I was all too familiar with, Kelly Clarkson. The music I heard coming from these AirPods, if you could even call it music, was not Kelly Clarkson's Since You've Been Gone. No, this was what I can only describe as the most demonic sounds I had ever heard in my life. It was a chorus of screams, women, children, monstrous creatures wailing in agony and at a volume so loud, I thought my eardrums had burst. It was similar to what I had imagined the depths of hell to sound like. I nearly smacked myself outside of the head trying to rip the AirPods out of my ears. I felt all the blood leave my body as my knees buckled beneath me. I couldn't move, I couldn't react, I couldn't even scream. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I was beginning to believe it was otherworldly. My sanity had fled me in a mere instant, and I had no idea what to do next. That evening, I contemplated checking myself into a mental hospital. The doppelganger AirPods had disappeared, but I had started to notice the clones of my belongings appearing more frequently. That same day, I had found 2 of the same ferns growing by my beside window when I knew I had only bought one. I tried to pour myself a glass of bourbon to calm my nerves and found 2 of the same limited edition Blood Oath Kentucky Straight bourbon bottles right beside each other. I had gotten only one as a gift on my 25th birthday. I even went to brush my teeth that night and found a replica of my same exact toothbrush, right down to the division of the bristles and the directions they were pointing in. I called out of work the next day and the following days after that. I couldn't function. I was living a life of dread, of trepidation. I was afraid to open my eyes. I was afraid to fall asleep. I felt as if I were going insane. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened tonight. I was holed up in the corner of my room sitting at my desk making a list of things that had duplicated themselves only to disappear in an instant. Throughout the course of the week, I had my laptop, my dresser, my picture frames, my pillows, and even my window duplicate themselves on more than one occasion. It had gotten to the point of being nearly inconvenient if not inconceivably terrifying, specifically when my dresser had cloned itself right in front of the doorway to my bathroom. I hadn't had any contact with the outside world since the AirPod incident. Hadn't seen or spoken to a human being in fear of them seeing through my veiled mental deterioration. I hadn't eaten or slept. I knew I would die if I kept living like this. At one point, I heard the front door of my apartment swing open followed by the muffled humming of my roommate as he made his way to his room. I knew he was my only chance at survival. He was the only other person I could cling to, that I could use as some token of normalcy. Someone to keep me grounded. I ran to my bedroom door and flung it open. I raced to the kitchen and caught him just before he had laid a hand on his bedroom door. I was panting like a marathon runner, and probably sweating like one too, but I didn't care. I didn't care about my appearance anymore, about how crazy I looked or about how crazy I was about to sound to him. I just needed someone to confide in. "Hey, man. What's going on?" he said casually as he turned his attention to my hunched-over form. His tone immediately changed from cordial to genuinely concerned. "Whoa, you okay?" I gasped, struggling to get the words out. "I have to talk to you about something. Something that's been going on here." "Whoa, whoa. All right. Take it easy, man. Let's sit down for a second." He had put his hands in front of him gently and was talking to me as if he were trying to coax a rabid animal. I remember thinking his calm, cool tone was particularly out of character given that, as I mentioned before, my roommate was a pretty odd guy and wasn't usually one to be great with social interactions. But, at that moment in time, his level of emotional intelligence was of very little concern to me. "You have to listen to me," I tried to say, swallowing the saliva that had accumulated in my mouth. "There's something really wrong with this place. I keep seeing double." "Seeing double? Like you're too fucked up or something? Is that what you mean?" He stifled a laugh, clearly an attempt to lighten the mood, but I persisted. No. I'm not drunk. I keep seeing things appear. Objects that are duplicating themselves." I knew how it sounded. I knew there was very little chance he would believe me, but I didn't care. I needed to find a solution. I needed to talk to someone about this. Anyone. "Dude, that's impossible. My roommate chuckled nervously. Are you sure you're not just having some eye problems or something? No. No. You're not listening to me. I was growing more and more agitated by the second. I can feel them, too. The replicated objects. They're physically there. You have to understand, suddenly. So suddenly, I saw something from behind my roommate. From behind his form. I saw movement. I know I did. I saw a figure. It was peeking at me from inside of his open bedroom door. Though it was dark, the only source of light coming from the kitchen, and it barely illuminated my roommate, let alone the area behind his large body, I saw it. I saw the glimmer of a black eye peeking at me from beyond him. It disappeared just as quickly as it appeared, as if it were snatched back into his room by an unseen force. I stared at my roommate with wild eyes. I pointed a shaky finger at him, ever so slowly. Who are you? I say, in a voice so low I almost didn't recognize it as my own. My roommate's face morphed from a concerned expression into one of sheer terror. What do you mean, man? Silence rang in the air and the tension was sharp enough to cut through steel. I stared at my roommate for God knows how long before I glanced once more at the doorway behind him just as the figure reappeared. I could only see half of its face, a dark, black eye, the corners of a mouth, and a long slim nose. I couldn't see a discernible expression, but I knew in my gut that I could see just enough to recognize those features, the too long nose, the high cheekbones, the shaggy, greasy hair. I knew it was him. Or one of him, at least. It was my roommate. All I had to see after that was the movement of its mouth as it formed one word, run. And that's just about what did it for me. I bursted into action, bolting towards the door and nearly ripping it off of its hinges as I threw myself into the hallway of our dingy apartment building. I raced down the hallway, pushing through the emergency exit doors and sprinting through the streets of DC, narrowly avoiding getting hit by a slew of cars on my way out. Yet, the entire time I could still hear them, the footsteps behind me. I didn't bother turning around. I ran for what felt like miles before finally slowing to a halt near a dimly lit dive bar on the wrong side of town. I ended up walking in for a drink because, Jesus, after that night, wouldn't you? And that takes me to where I am now, sipping on a vodka soda, sitting here typing this all out, recounting the past few weeks that have been nothing but complete chaos. I was lucky enough to have had my phone in my back pocket when the whole situation with my roommate went down. I'm surprised it didn't fly out as I ran for my life down the streets of DC. I don't know what to do. I can't call the police. I'll sound like a complete lunatic. Regardless, I know what I saw. I know there's something seriously wrong. The only upside of this night is that during the time I took to write this out, someone must have noticed how troubled I looked and ordered me another vodka soda, because now there are two sitting in front of me. There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sunset and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now when I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration except for "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right?" "I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty. 1 for me and 1 for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole 6-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again I scanned the faces staring back at me. All barely illuminated by the light from the fire. All familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I mean... I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. "Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it," Dave said. "But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now." Someone else said, "Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow." Eric agreed. I tried to protest but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. "Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe," Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought 1-person tents with us, but we could squeeze 2 if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally, like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here? Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally and... I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U-shape so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think he was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look over at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it. His head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 5 of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny, please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point there were 3 of us running on the trail, Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds.